Before today's video starts, I just want to bring you a quick word from our sponsor, Vikings War of Clans. Vikings War of Clans is an incredibly fun browser game that is easy to get into. I've been playing Vikings on my browser for 2 months and I'm addicted to playing it. Vikings has fantastic graphics and incredibly immersive gameplay. Amazingly, even though the game has stunning graphics, you don't have to download it. You can just play it on your browser. Vikings is amazing to play on a big screen. In the game, you can join clans, and then you get to work together with players from all over the world. Vikings is a high quality game, and it's absolutely free to play. It's also fast and easy to register. Join Vikings for free by clicking on my link in the description box below and get a cool bonus of 200 gold coins to kickstart your game. So please check out Vikings War of Clans today, because I know you'll enjoy the game and you'll be supporting Criminally Listed. Number 3. Richard Alfredo. In early 1990, 61-year-old Richard Alfredo lived in Westport, Massachusetts with his girlfriend, 38-year-old Christina Martin, Martin's daughter, Tisha Pauline, and her son, Sean Pauline. On January 21, 1990, Martin called 911 because she found Alfredo unresponsive in their home. He was rushed to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead not long afterward. Alfredo had heart disease. Several years earlier, he had undergone cardiac bypass surgery. So when he died, there was no autopsy. It was just assumed that he died from a heart attack. But then, in the weeks after his death, several people contacted the police with information about Alfredo's death. They were friends of 14-year-old Tisha Pauline. Tisha supposedly told her friends that Alfredo had been sexually abusing her for years. To get revenge on him, Tisha said that her mother put the hallucinogenic drug, LSD, into some jello and she served it to him. LSD causes the heart rate to increase. So when Alfredo ate the jello that was laced with the LSD, his unhealthy heart sped up and he had a heart attack. The police then interviewed teenagers who lived in the same neighborhood as Martin, Alfredo, and Tisha. Several of them said that Martin and Tisha wanted to buy mescaline from them. Martin and Tisha supposedly told them that they wanted to poison Alfredo with the mescaline. The teenagers said that they felt uneasy about that, so they sold them crushed up Tylenol pills and told them it was mescaline. The mother and daughter supposedly finally did get some drugs from a local drug dealer. They thought it was mescaline, but it was actually LSD. After talking to the teenagers and the drug dealer, Alfredo's body was exhumed. His body had been buried for 31 days. But there was a problem with the body. A lot of groundwater had gotten into the coffin and significantly damaged the body. Nevertheless, the medical examiner performed an autopsy. Alfredo's blood could not be tested because his body had been embalmed, so there was no blood in his body. However, some urine was found in his body and it was tested. The test indicated that there were high levels of LSD in his system. Martin and Tisha were questioned several times by the police. Then 2 days after their last interview, the police went to arrest Martin. When the police arrived at her home, they found out that she and her children had fled. Using phone records, the police tracked them to Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Martin was arrested in April 1990, 2 months after she fled, and she was charged with murder. Tisha was not charged with anything. Christina Martin went to trial in November 1992. At the trial, Tisha testified. Tisha said that she was the one who put the LSD into Alfredo's jello. She claimed that her mother did not know anything about it until after Alfredo ingested the drugs and started acting strangely. Tisha said she poisoned Alfredo because he had been sexually abusing her for years. The prosecution said that Tisha was not the one who poisoned Alfredo. They said she was just taking the blame because she was a juvenile and she would receive a less severe punishment than her mother. The prosecution said that Martin killed Alfredo because she wanted his money and his property. The prosecutor also pointed out that when Martin thought that the police were going to arrest her, she fled the country. The prosecutor said that innocent people don't run. The teenagers also testified, and they said that both Martin and Tisha tried to buy drugs from them. A drug dealer testified as well. He said that before Alfredo died, he had sold some LSD to a small group of people, and part of that group of people was Martin and Tisha. The results of the test of the urine sample were also introduced as evidence. Then the medical examiner testified. He said that Alfredo had died from a heart attack caused by acute LSD poisoning. Amazingly, Martin's lawyer did not ask the medical examiner any questions when he had a chance to cross-examine him. The judge thought that this was odd, and he pulled the lawyer aside to ask him why he didn't ask any questions. The lawyer said he would address the points raised by the medical examiner in his defense, but he never did. The jury deliberated for about 5.5 hours and found Martin guilty. Martin was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. 5 years later, a public defender named Kevin Mahoney was assigned to do a routine appeal on Martin's case. Mahoney went to the courthouse to pick up the case file, and as he was waiting at the desk for the clerk to give him the file, he started talking to another man who was also standing at the desk. The man was an assistant district attorney. Mahoney told him he was working on an appeal for Christina Martin. The assistant district attorney said he remembered the case, and he told Mahoney to look closely at the cause of death. After that conversation, Mahoney went through the details of the case very closely, and he found several significant problems. The first was motive. The prosecution said that Martin killed Alfredo to get his money and property. Although Alfredo and Martin had been living together for 5 years before he died, Alfredo was still legally married to his estranged wife. When he died, all the money that he had, which was about $25,000, went to his estranged wife and the son that they had together. After Alfredo died, Martin and her children continued to live in the house that they shared with Alfredo. So there was no real financial gain for Martin to kill Alfredo. Mahoney found much bigger problems with the cause of death and the test that revealed that there was LSD in Alfredo's system. The medical examiner said that Alfredo died from a heart attack caused by acute LSD intoxication. The problem was that there is not a single case of someone dying directly from LSD intoxication. In fact, there is no known lethal dosage of LSD. If someone does die while they are on LSD, it's either because they had an accident or they take their own life. Had the jury known that no one else has ever died of LSD intoxication, they may have had some reasonable doubt that Martin killed her live-in boyfriend with LSD. But at her trial, Barton's lawyer didn't ask the medical examiner a single question, and he didn't bring up the medical examiner's findings in his defense. Then there was the test that supposedly showed that there was LSD in Alfredo's system. The problem was that the test was only supposed to use fresh urine. When Alfredo's urine was tested, it was taken from his body, which had been embalmed and buried for 31 days. During those 31 days, his grave flooded with groundwater. The embalming fluid in the groundwater could have very easily contaminated the urine that was found in his body. So it's very unlikely that the test results were accurate. Also, the test was only supposed to be used to screen for toxins, and the results were only preliminary. A secondary test needed to be performed to verify the results. These instructions were clearly stated on the box which contained the test. It turned out that the district attorney's office did order several follow-up tests to be conducted. The results for all the follow-up tests were all the same. They did not show any traces of LSD. When the district attorney's office did not get the results they wanted from the test, they buried the results, and they did not turn them over to Martin's lawyer. This was a violation of the Brady Doctrine, which says that the prosecution must hand over all exculpatory evidence to the defendant in a criminal case. If Alfredo wasn't poisoned with LSD, then why did the preliminary test show signs of LSD in his body? LSD is a chemical compound. The chemicals that make up LSD can be found naturally in the human body, groundwater, and embalming fluid. So it's possible that the LSD was naturally created in the urine after Alfredo's body spent 31 days buried. These findings gave Kevin Mahoney two arguments for Christina Martin's appeal. The first was that the prosecution violated the Brady Doctrine when they didn't share the results of the test that showed that there was no LSD in Alfredo's body. The second was that Martin had ineffectual counsel. Her lawyer should have questioned the medical examiner about the results of the test. Christina Martin won her appeal. In November 1997, 5 years after she was convicted, her conviction was overturned. Martin had been incarcerated since her arrest in April 1990, so she had spent about 7.5 years in prison. The state appealed the decision. In July 1998, the appeal was upheld, and Christina Martin was to be given another trial. Before she could go to trial again, the prosecution offered her a plea deal. She could plead guilty and be sentenced to time served, which was 8 years, plus 10 years probation. In February 1999, she took the plea deal. In court, she admitted she secretly gave her boyfriend, Richard Alfredo, LSD, and this killed him. She then walked out of the court a free woman. Outside the courthouse, Martin talked to reporters. She swore she was innocent, but she did not want to risk going back to trial in case she was convicted again and sentenced to another life term. Number 2. Mary DeMera. At 6:10 p.m. on May 26, 1991, 21-year-old Jim Trevay, who lived in Leiden, South Holland, called the emergency telephone number. He had found his mother, 53-year-old Mary DeMera, lying face down on the floor in their living room. He knew that his mother was dead. The police arrived and they turned the body over. The only wound was some swelling around the right eye. Also, there were some drops of blood on her clothes and on the rug where her body was lying. Otherwise, there were no signs of trauma. Since the 53-year-old woman had died unexpectedly, an autopsy was performed. During the autopsy, the medical examiner made a remarkable discovery. Inside Tamara's right eye socket and cranial cavity, there was an undamaged Bic ballpoint pen. It had gone through her right eye and stabbed her in the brain. The pen had completely entered her head, and it was not visible from the outside of her body. The injury would have caused her to die within minutes. The police concluded that Tamara had been murdered. One reason they thought this was because the pen was black ink, and they looked around her home, and they found nothing written or marked in black ink. Also, friends, family, and neighbors said that Tamara never used ballpoint pens. Instead, she supposedly wrote everything with felt-tip pens. But the police couldn't find any evidence of who killed her, so the case was dropped in August 1992, about 14 months after her death. Not long after the police chose to drop the case, the former therapist of Tamara's son, Jim Trevay, went to the police. The therapist told the police that Trevay had confessed to her that he killed his mother. She said that Trevay had told her that he shot the pen into his mother with a crossbow. She also told the police that normally she would not violate her doctor-patient confidentiality, but she was concerned. She said that Trevay had a personality disorder and she was worried he might harm someone else. The police thought that the information that the therapist gave them was interesting because of some other interviews they had conducted. Notably, some of Trevay's friends from high school said that he had talked about committing the perfect murder. The weapon in his perfect murder plan was a ballpoint pen. Although the police never found a crossbow in Trevay's possession, he supposedly had experience using a crossbow. He was part of a shooting club, and at one time, he had purchased crossbow arrows. Trevay also supposedly discussed with a friend how you would kill someone with a crossbow. His friend told him the best way to do it was to shoot them in the eye. And finally, Trevay had an alibi for the night that his mother died, but the police didn't find his alibi convincing. Trevay went to trial for the murder of his mother in the autumn of 1995. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to 12 years of prison. Trevay appealed the conviction. At his appeal hearing, the results of several experiments were entered into evidence. An ophthalmologist, which is an eye doctor, performed experiments with 2 human heads that were donated to science. He used 2 different crossbows. One crossbow was more powerful than the other. He fired 6 ballpoint pens at the eye sockets. He found that each time, the pen did not completely enter the eye socket and cranial cavity. Instead, 2.3 to 3.6 inches of the 5.7-inch pen remained outside the socket. Also, every time the pen was fired, the back end of the pen was damaged by the string of the crossbow. The pen found in Tamara's head was completely embedded, and it was undamaged. A second ophthalmologist repeated the experiment using the parts of 2 human heads. He got very similar results. The pen was never completely embedded, and there was damage at the back end from the string. Jim Trevay's father was a professor of theoretical physics. He did several experiments using mathematical equations. His experiments showed that a crossbow could not have created enough velocity for a ballpoint pen to completely enter a human head. The defense said that the results of the experiments prove that DiMera's death was not a murder, but instead, it was a tragic accident. The most likely scenario was that DiMera was walking while holding the pen in her right hand. She fell face down, and the pen went directly into her right eye socket. Part of the appeal process was that the Dutch Forensics Institute, known by its acronym NFI, had to replicate the results of the experiments. After they conducted their tests, they did not agree with the findings of the two ophthalmologists and Hervé's father. They said that since the pen embedded itself at different lengths in each test, it was impossible to say with certainty that the pen would never enter the head entirely. Secondly, even though it was believed that Hervé owned a crossbow, it was never found. Since they didn't know the exact model of the crossbow, they couldn't say with certainty that the crossbow wasn't powerful enough to embed the pen, nor could they say that the string would always damage the pen. Also, the test assumed that the pen went all the way into the head after it was shot from the crossbow. They said it was possible that it only got partially embedded and then went in the rest of the way when DiMera fell face down on the floor. The Court of Appeals ruled that the experiments were unable to prove one way or the other if it was an accident or murder. At the appeal hearing, Hervé's therapist testified again. When the therapist told the police that Hervé had confessed to her, it restarted the investigation and it focused the police's attention on Hervé. Also, in the first trial, the testimony of the therapist was considered the most damning. At the appeal trial, the therapist said she couldn't say with certainty if Hervé was telling the truth when he confessed. Since she was unsure, her original testimony was excluded as evidence. Without her testimony, there was no definitive evidence that DiMera was murdered or that her son killed her. The result of the appeal was that Hervé was acquitted of all charges. He was never brought to trial again. The death of Mary DiMera, which is also called the ballpoint pen murder or the ballpoint pen affair, is one of the most controversial cases in the history of the Dutch legal system. There is still debate if DiMera's death was a horrifying murder or just a disturbing freak accident. Number 1. Sandra Maloney. John and Sandra Maloney of Green Bay, Wisconsin were high school sweethearts. They got married in 1978 and they went on to have 3 sons together, Matt, Sean, and Aaron. John got a job as a police officer with the Green Bay Police Department and Sandra stayed home with the kids. Sandra also watched other children who lived in their neighborhood. Things were pretty idyllic for the family until the early 1990s. Then one morning, Sandra woke up with a stiff neck. She became terrified that she might have multiple sclerosis, so she went and saw a doctor. She was sent to see a neurologist. The neurologist ran some tests and determined that she did not have MS. He prescribed a drug that was supposed to help with her anxiety. The problem was that the drug was highly addictive. Over the next several years, Sandra became addicted to prescription drugs. Then she started mixing the drugs with vodka. Things got to be so bad that when her sons needed medication, the pharmacist would make them take the drugs in front of him. One of her sons later admitted that their mother would get them to hide the pills under their tongue and then give it to her afterward. Sandra went for inpatient addiction treatment, but she refused to get outpatient treatment. She ended up relapsing. In May 1997, Sandra was drunk and she was driving. She ended up totaling the family's car. This was the final straw for John. He left Sandra and he took their 3 sons with him. Shortly afterward, he filed for divorce. There was a custody battle for the 3 boys, and Sandra ended up losing. February 11th, 1998 was the last day of their divorce hearing. Sandra didn't show up for court. On the same morning that Sandra should have been in court, Sandra's mother, Lola Catter, went to her daughter's home. Once Catter got inside, she noticed a distinct smell. She ventured further into the home and she found Sandra on the couch in the main floor living room. Her body was burned beyond recognition. Immediately, Catter thought she knew what happened. She was sure that John had killed her daughter. Catter knew that John was angry with Sandra because she had been procrastinating when it came to dealing with the divorce. John, who was 42, was dating a 28-year-old woman, and the girlfriend wanted Sandra out of their lives. An autopsy was performed, and the medical examiner said that Sandra had died from a combination of blunt force trauma to the back of the head, strangulation, and suffocation. Like Lola Catter, the special prosecutor, Joe Paulus, was convinced that John had killed his estranged wife. He said that the evidence showed that John and Sandra got into an argument. He hit her in the back of the head with an object, and she started bleeding. John then panicked and strangled Sandra to death with a length of rope. In a hamper in the basement, the police found a bloody shirt that belonged to Sandra. The police think that after striking Sandra, John put her shirt in the hamper to hide it. He put her body on the couch and then dropped some cigarettes around her body. The cigarettes would make it look like the fire was started because Sandra fell asleep while she was smoking. Then he doused her body with vodka and set it ablaze to try to cover up what he did. The prosecutor learned that John's 28-year-old girlfriend, Tracy Hellebrand, had given John an ultimatum. He had to get Sandra out of their lives or she was going to leave him. Before she died, Sandra had told several people, including her psychiatrist, that John was abusive. As proof, she showed people the bruises that she said he caused. The medical examiner thought that Sandra had died on February 10th, the night before her body was found. The prosecution's problem was that they couldn't prove that John was in Sandra's house that night. The prosecutor then enlisted the help of John's girlfriend, Tracy Hellebrand. Hellebrand convinced John to meet with her in a hotel room in Las Vegas, Nevada. What John didn't know was that the room had been wired to record sound and videotape them. Once they were in the hotel room, Hellebrand bombarded him with accusations that he killed Sandra. As Hellebrand accused him, John lost his temper several times. He screamed and swore at her. At one point, he put his hands around her throat. After several hours, John admitted that he was in Sandra's house on the night that she died. John was arrested that day and charged with first-degree murder. John went to trial in February 1999, a year after Sandra's death. The prosecution's case was pretty straightforward. John wanted Sandra dead so he could start a new life with his younger girlfriend. He hit Sandra in the back of the head and then strangled her. Afterward, he dumped some cigarettes around Sandra's body to make it look like she had fallen asleep with a lit cigarette. He poured vodka on the body as an accelerant and set the body on fire to try to cover up the head injury and the strangulation marks. An edited version of footage of Hellebrand accusing John of murdering Sandra was shown to the jury. In the footage, the jury saw John lose his temper several times and wrap his hands around Hellebrand's throat. Hellebrand testified for the prosecution. She said that she remembered that John smelled like smoke after he came home from visiting Sandra on the night that she died. John's lawyer contended that there was an alternative suspect, and that was Tracy Hellebrand. He pointed out that Hellebrand was the person who desperately wanted Sandra out of their lives. The trial lasted for 8 days, and the jury deliberated for 12 hours. They found John Maloney guilty of first-degree murder. In April 1999, John was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole for 25 years. A few months after John was sentenced, a nonprofit group based in Virginia called Truth and Justice took up his case. They discovered some evidence that had not been presented at the trial. The president of Truth and Justice, Sheila Berry, said that the evidence shows that John did not murder Sandra. She said the evidence shows that Sandra wasn't even murdered. The first piece of evidence is a photograph of the basement of the house taken on the day that Sandra's body was found. In the photograph, there is a coffee table, and on the coffee table, there are 2 VCRs. Hanging from an overhead pipe is a rope. A forensic expert sprayed luminol around the basement and found traces of blood that had been cleaned up. Sheila Berry said that this is all evidence that Sandra tried to kill herself. She said that Sandra stood on top of the VCRs on the coffee table with a rope tied around her neck. She then jumped and the rope was supposed to strangle her. But something went wrong and Sandra fell to the floor, hitting the back of her head on the coffee table in the process. This is how Sandra sustained the head injury. The rope would have also left strangulation marks on her neck. After Sandra hit her head, she put her bloody shirt in the laundry hamper and then showered in the basement shower. She also cleaned up all the blood in the basement. Then she went upstairs to the couch and lit a cigarette. On the night Sandra died, she was very drunk. She lit a cigarette and then she either passed out from drinking too much or she lost consciousness because of the head injury. Then the cigarette started the fire. Evidence that Sandra was at least contemplating suicide were 5 notes that were written by her that were found in her bedroom. They all read like they were suicide notes. The photograph of the basement and the supposed suicide notes were never entered as evidence. Another problem with the case is that the prosecution argued that John set the body on fire because he thought that the fire would have covered up the head injury and the strangulation marks. John was a detective and he specialized in arson. In the 2.5 years before Sandra's death, John had been the police department's arson investigator. John most likely would have known that the fire wouldn't destroy evidence of the wounds. Also, the prosecution said that there was a burn pattern that indicated vodka was used as an accelerant. Sheila Berry had an arson expert do an experiment. The expert got the same model of couch where Sandra's body was found. He set the couch on fire and the cushions started to melt right away. The way they melted created an identical burn pattern thought to be left by the vodka. In court, the prosecution had witnesses testify who said that John was abusive. Several people said that they saw bruises on Sandra's body. But John and Sandra's son said that their father wasn't the abusive one. They said if there was a physical altercation, it was their mother physically attacking their father. They also said that their mother probably had bruises because she tended to be clumsy when she was intoxicated, and she was intoxicated all the time. Something else that was quite damning was that John admitted that he was at Sandra's house on the night she died. John said he just talked to her about how important it was to show up for the divorce hearing the next day. John said when he left, Sandra was still alive. The medical examiner thought that Sandra died sometime between 6 and 8 p.m. that night. John and Sandra's 3 sons said that their father was home with them at that time. They all set up bunk beds together. Then in 2002, the case took a strange turn. One of the prosecutors on John's case was Joe Paulus. He was an attention-hungry and driven prosecutor who wanted to become a U.S. attorney. In March 2002, the FBI started investigating Paulus over allegations of corruption. Specifically, he had been accused of taking bribes to fix cases. At first, Paulus denied any wrongdoing. But then, in April 2004, he agreed to a plea deal. He admitted to taking $48,000 to fix 22 cases, 6 of which were criminal cases. He ended up being sentenced to 4 years of prison. All the cases that Paulus fixed happened between June 1998 and June 2000. John Maloney was arrested, tried, and convicted between July 1998 and February 1999. John was a police officer who had been accused of murdering his estranged wife so he could start a new life with his younger girlfriend. It was a high-profile case in Wisconsin, and a lot of people thought that securing a conviction would go a long way to helping Paulus's career. However, there is no evidence that Paulus did anything illegal in John's case. That being said, he did not disclose evidence that was favorable to John. Something else to note is just before he left the district attorney's office, Paulus ordered someone to get the case file on Sandra's death out of the office. The case file was then transferred from office to office, and a lot of information and evidence in the file has been lost because of the transfers. Another problem with the evidence was the hidden camera footage from the hotel room. In the footage, John loses his temper several times, and he admits to being at Sandra's home on the night she died. Many people thought that the footage was the most damning evidence at the trial. It turned out that Paulus had paid $27,000 to have the video edited. The video was supposed to be cut down to make it shorter, without removing any of the important content. In total, there was 18 hours of footage, and the jury only saw 4 hours of footage. In the case file, there was a note from Paulus to the video editor, which reads, "I've replaced, modified, or add new excerpts to be included in the tape." The editor replied with a note of his own, which reads, "Some of your clips are so short, 1.5 seconds in duration, that they may seem choppy. The co-prosecutor who worked on the case with Paulus was asked if Paulus doctored the videotape to make John look worse, and he said not to his knowledge. The co-prosecutor was also asked if John got a fair trial, and he said no, because not all the evidence was presented. Another prosecutor who worked on the case said that the suicide theory is a fantasy, and he is sure that John killed Sandra. John Maloney is currently incarcerated at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He'll be able to apply for parole in 2024. Thanks a lot for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminalist.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. But that is all for today. Thank you again for watching.